Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law.
Love is the law, love your will.
All right, thanks everyone for making it out tonight. Just for those who aren't familiar, this is Blazing Star Oasis, a chartered body of Ordo Templi Orientis and O.T.O. And so we do a couple of things here. Essentially, our activities at Blazing Star Oasis can be categorized into two groups. On the one hand, we have our MMM, our Mysteria Mystica Maxima, which is the initiatory branch of the O.T.O. Initiations begin with a mineral initiation, and then the rest kind of follows and unfolds from there. So on the one hand, we have the initiatory branch, and on the other hand, we have activities in the EGC, or Ecclesia Gnostica Catholica. And this is the church of the O.T.O. And in the church, we celebrate the Gnostic Mass. We have the rites of baptism, confirmation, and ordination. And so if you're ever interested in seeing what we do in the EGC, every Sunday we have a Gnostic Mass, which is open to the public. The doors open at 3:30 and we begin at 4:30. Okay, so my name is Neil. I am the master of Blazing Star Oasis, and I want to talk tonight about the theory and practice of scrying. So who here is familiar with scrying or has had some practice with scrying? Okay, most of you. Good. Okay, so I really like this topic. I like giving classes on this, I like thinking about this, I like practicing this. Scrying just generally has been an essential part of my own magical practice. I find that it accomplishes a number of different things. So on the one hand, you can employ it in a number of different types of ritual. So it's very easily constructed such that you can stick it into the ritual structure of a number of different rituals. And I think there's no quicker way to become acquainted with the magical universe than practicing scrying. So essentially what it involves is diving into the spirit world, or the unconscious. There's various ways of talking about this, which we'll go over tonight, and experiencing an encounter with what we might call the other, right? Something which is distinct, let's say, from our ordinary modes of cognition. And my experience with scrying is that it doesn't take too long when you're practicing scrying for little fissures starting to open up in reality and the imaginal starting to seep through and enchanting one's experience. So I really like this stuff, and I think it's really effective. And so what we're going to be doing tonight is plugging the practice of scrying into a ritualistic structure, right? So we're going to set up a magical environment or container so that we can direct the contents that we receive through the practice of scrying to a particular end. Okay, so with that being said, first what we'll do is talk about the theory and practice of scrying. And once we're done with that, once we get a little further into the evening, we'll actually do a ritual, right? And do some scrying. And this is the outline of the ritual, and I want to go over it with you real quick so that you can be ready for what is coming up this evening. So the first thing that we're going to do is begin with a relaxation meditation. And this is just a way to begin to get you into a receptive state so that you're attending to your inner sensorium and beginning to pay attention to what is going on inside of you. The next thing we'll do is a call to the spirit of the hour. So one of the things I like to do in scrying and in magic generally is employ ritual in conjunction with various astrological timings. I have found that this is a very useful tool. And so what we'll be doing tonight is calling a spirit of Tuesday, which is dedicated to the hour of the moon, in which we will be scrying. I could talk more about how to do this, but it would take a whole nother class, so I kind of have to go over it quickly. The general idea is that there's a way of calculating planetary days and hours. And it's done by taking the hour of sunrise and the hour of sunset and dividing that time into a series of 12. And so you get a series of 12 hours during that period, and each hour is dedicated to a particular planet. And as we all know, the days of the week are themselves governed over by the planets or the gods associated with the planets, right? So Monday is the day of the moon, Tuesday is Mars's day, Wednesday is Mercury's day, Thursday is Jupiter's day. And so since we are invoking and scrying Aries tonight, the god of war, Tuesday, it's an appropriate day for a martial invocation. And the hour that we're going to be working in is the hour of the moon. So I've got a list of a couple of spirits who I will invoke for that particular hour. They're taken from a 13th century grimoire called the Hygromantia. And I've found it to be very effective. And in the Hygromantia, it's said that this particular hour that we'll be working in tonight is good in terms of stimulating one's personal work. So, for what that's worth, hopefully we all get something like that out of it. Okay, so it'll be a call to the spirit of the hour. We'll purify and consecrate the temple. And then there will be an invocation known as the headless rite. So this is an invocation which is designed for a particular magical operation, which is found in the Greek magical papyri, which is a 2nd century AD text written by a Greco-Egyptian priest, presumably, as far as we know. And Crowley and Mathers actually got their hands on this text in the early 20th century, and they translated it, and they kind of mistranslated it, as the bornless rite, right? I prefer the original one, right? So that's what we'll be doing here. I'm going to use it as a kind of a general invocation. Then there will be an invocation of the spirit of the deep, which is just sort of one line. The spirit of the deep is a spirit that Carl Jung, the famous psychoanalyst, used and invoked when he was doing his work on the Red Book. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Red Book. It's basically Jung's travels and journeys in the unconscious. And so we'll be using that. And then there will be the particular invocation from the Orphic hymns, and it's the hymn to Aries. Right? And in fact, I'm going to read that for you right now so you have some sense what the invocation is. If I don't trip over myself. Okay, so this is the invocation that this is the god we're going to be calling on for this particular scrying. So to Aries, unbreakable, strong-spirited, mighty, powerful daemon, delighting in arms, indomitable, man-slaying, wall-battering, Lord Aries, yours is the din of arms. Ever bespattered with blood, you find joy in killing in the fray of battle. O horrid one, your desire is for the rude clash of swords and spears. Stay the rage, stay the strife. Relax pain's grip on my soul. Yield to the wish of Cyprus. Yield to the revels of Laios. Exchange the might of arms for the works of O.T.O, yearning for youth, nurturing peace, bliss-bringing peace. Okay, so you'll hear that again, and I think one of the things that people might sort of associate with the invocation of Mars is the invocation of martial energy. Like, I'm trying to bring martial energy into my life. And that is not necessarily the purpose of this invocation. So traditionally, you might invoke a spirit which presides over a particular domain of human activity, not only to get more of that thing, but to make sure that that thing stays in check, right? So if you were looking to cure a disease, let's say, some kind of sickness, you might choose a spirit that presided over sickness, right? Which looks kind of like a scary spirit, but that's the spirit which has domain over all those things which involve sickness. So you can invoke that type of spirit as a kind of a remedy, right? Or a remediation for that quality as it manifests in your life. And given that we are in a period of Mars retrograde now, which is essentially a time when Mars is most Marsy, right? When there's a lot of Mars going around, we're invoking Mars in order to get a sense of how this energy is manifesting in our own lives and how to meet some of the challenges that might arise given just the general condition of things right now, right? So the invocation of Aries is a way to harness that energy, get a grip on it, and figure out how that can be most profitably channeled in our own lives, but also the particular challenges that we might encounter during this roughly 2-month period when Mars is retrograde. Okay, so we'll do the Orphic hymn to Aries, and then we'll scry. And we're going to talk a lot about what scrying is in just a minute. Afterwards, we will write our experiences down on a piece of paper or in a journal. If you don't have a piece of paper or a journal with you, we will provide you with one and a pen or a pencil that you can write with. And then there will be a brief license to depart. And if we have some time, we can, if we feel inclined, talk about some of the experiences that we had in the session. Okay, so you might also notice that there are no banishing rituals in here, right? Some people might be surprised by that. I've come to prefer not using them in much of my magical work. If you are inclined to use banishing rituals, and I think it's a great tool that people can utilize, you might see those at the very beginning and the very end of a ritual outline like this. Right? Okay. Good. So any questions? Does that kind of make sense? A little bit?
I missed some part of the end.
Okay. We'll go over this again at the end.
Okay.
So.
Hi, June. Hi.
Hello.
Okay. So what is scrying? A definition that I landed on, which I think condenses a lot of the other information I was reading, is this. So, scrying is producing visions and our spirit contact in a specified medium of choice. Okay, so producing visions and our spirit contact in a specified medium of choice. And one of the problems with giving a definition of scrying is that it's such a broad and general practice which appears in so many different areas that it's hard to really nail down something precise for it. It kind of blends into a lot of different things. So what I have here is just a list of some of the ways in which scrying is often employed. So you're all probably familiar with crystal gazing, right? Looking into a crystal ball. So that would be a means of putting yourself into a hypnagogic state, staring at a crystal, right? And using that as the medium through which a vision is produced, or through which you communicate with spirits of one form or another. The tattvas, right? So these are pictorial representations of the elements, which supposedly originally come from Hindu philosophy. I don't know much about the history there, but the Golden Dawn employs these as a way of producing visions to gain more information about what those particular tattvas represent. Right? So the way in which that might be done is one would set up a ritual setting, do some kind of ritual operation, have the picture of the tattva in front of them, and sort of mentally project themselves into the tattva and go into it, and have that be the springboard for a astral vision which would come from that, right? And then explore the terrain of that particular tattva. This is also done with tarot cards, right? So if anybody has read Donald Michael Craig's book, Modern Magic, I think one of the early exercises in that one is you take a tarot card, you're meditating on some tarot card like every day, one of the trumps, and you engage in a short meditative exercise. First, you're just looking at it, but then you kind of project yourself into the card. And you use that as a springboard for a vision which can give you information which is pertinent to that particular card, right? So we did a whole series, we scryed all 22 trumps at BSO a couple of years ago, and it was a really cool way of learning more about the tarot and also getting a lot of practice with scrying. Pathworking, right? So this is another practice which is often seen in association with Golden Dawn work. And this is a sort of a means of scrying the paths on the tree of life, right? The Enochian Aethers, right? So a big part of the Enochian work is scrying. So John Dee and Edward Kelly were both Renaissance mages, and they use a crystal ball, what they called a shoe stone, to gain access to a particular order of angelic beings, which eventually were called Enochian, right? Enochian angels. And they received a system of magic through it, right? So they were instructed by the angels how to do some high-powered ritual magic. And the fact that many people are practicing Enochian magic today is a testament, I think, to how successful they were in their work. Right? Shamanic journeying. That's a problematic term in itself, but so there are various ways in which one can get into trance. So you might use ritual drumming, for instance, or you might use dancing, or you might use the ingestion of particular ethanogenic substances to propel yourself into an otherworldly experience and go traveling and attempt to contact beings in another place, and then bring back that information to the everyday conscious waking life and use that in some way to help the community. Active imagination was a technique which was developed by Carl Jung, and it's no surprise that he was able to land on this because he was so steeped in esotericism. It's really not surprising that he figured this out. So at a certain point in Carl Jung's career, he split with Sigmund Freud and was going through a period of psychological difficulties. He thought he was going insane. And instead of fleeing from the contents which were just spontaneously bursting forth in his mind, he decided that he was going to embrace them and encounter them. And so one of the ways in which he did this is he put himself into something like a hypnagogic state and allowed those images which were coming forth from within him to speak for themselves, right? To begin to talk to him. And he recorded most of this stuff in what is known as the Red Book, which was only published in early 2000s, right? So a long time after Jung's death. And it is an account of Jung's journey in the other world, right? He called it the unconscious. But Essentially, it's very much like these other forms of scrying with some caveats. Okay? And so generally, the idea is to get oneself into like a hypnagogic state or trance. Use some kind of medium to then journey into the other world. Right? Encounter landscapes, topographies, and beings in that other world, and bring that information back and put it to use in one's own life. Okay. I should also say that just because a spirit or a being says something to you doesn't necessarily mean it's true, right? So once you get your information, and we'll talk about this, there is a process of integrating that information and sifting through it and seeing what might actually be useful and relevant to your own life. Okay. So essentially, I see scrying as a form of vision magic, right? So magic in the Crowleyan sense is causing change in conformity with will. And what we're attempting to do by gaining access to this other world is causing change through the visions that we have in our scrying. So, for instance, tonight we have a particular end of trying to meet some of the challenges within this period of Mars retrograde. Right? If we can get some useful information in order to accomplish that end, we'd be doing some magic. Okay, and just a clarification. When we say vision, like we don't mean the same thing, and you all know this. We don't mean the same thing as just sensory perception. Right? What we're talking about is an experience of seeing in an altered state of consciousness, right? Whether that be a dream, trance, or a hypnagogic state. Right? So for what it's worth, I do find that these visions start to seep into empirical reality in very interesting ways. But when we're talking about vision magic, we're talking about enabling ourselves to make a break with our normal modes of perception and cognition, and to open up a space so that those things which we're not normally paying attention to can come through. Right? And the reason why we put this into a ritualistic context is because that can be a fairly chaotic thing, right? So if you take a bunch of psychedelics, you might have a rad, chaotic, visionary experience, and that's great. I think that's wonderful, right? But we are doing something slightly different in ritual magic when we set a particular intent, right? So we're invoking Aries, the god of war. So we want that break with our normal consciousness. We want something very specific to come through, right? That we're going to utilize for our personal growth and transformation. Okay. So I want to talk about some theory now. What is going on when we're scrying? I'm going to try to lay out sort of it's not a fully fleshed out philosophical framework, but it is an attempt to get some philosophical scaffolding around the types of experiences that occur when we're scrying, so that we have just sort of a little bit more of a sophisticated way of approaching them. So common assumption, visions are imaginary, unreal, and pretend, right? The imagination, the visions which are produced in the imagination are whimsical fancy, and they don't contain any useful, ultimately, information, right? So compared with the natural sciences and the rigors of logic, imagination sort of has been kicked out of the room and has a seat at the kids' table. And I think that's totally backwards, right? So my take on this is that the imagination is an epistemologically robust mechanism whereby we can get at the real, right? So I think it actually can confer knowledge that we can't get by other means, right? So a part of what we're going to try and do right now is rehabilitate the imagination and show that it can be a very important tool for gaining knowledge about ourselves and the world. Okay, so there's a thinker, Henry Corbin was a 20th century, early 20th century philosopher and scholar of religions who specialized in Islamic mysticism. And he made this distinction between the imaginary and the imaginal. And he used the term imaginary as referring to the connotations that we often carry with that word imaginary, right? So fantasy, figments of the imagination, something which is unreal. And he thought that there were legitimate uses for this term because sometimes our imagination can be fickle and not really be of any huge significance in our lives. But he distinguished that from the imaginal, right? And he coined this term the mundus imaginalis, the imaginal world. So through looking at a variety of visionary experiences from Islamic mystics, Sufis, he saw that there was this constant theme of them going into and recognizing a dimension of being which essentially consisted of image and symbols, right? And he came to the conclusion, along with these mystics, that there was really something significant going on there that needed to be paid more attention to. And so he coined this term, the mundus imaginalis, the imaginal world. And the mundus imaginalis, according to Corbin, is consists of topographical regions encountered in visionary experience. Right? So oftentimes these mystics would find themselves transported to another place, right? To another dimension. And the experiences that they had there were profound religious experiences which changed their lives. And Corbin wanted to show that this was a common theme across numerous mystical traditions, that there was this place that mystics seemed to be able to transport themselves to through various means and have experiences which would radically alter who they were and their conceptions of the universe. So this is Crowley, and I think Crowley has a very similar idea in a little essay called Notes for an Astral Atlas. And if you're into scrying, I highly recommend reading this essay. It's really cool. And so here's Crowley. The variety of the general character of the planes of being is indefinitely large. But there are several main types of symbolism corresponding to the forms of plastic presentation established by the minds of mankind. Each such plane has its special appearances, inhabitants, and laws, special cases of the general proposition. So Crowley is recognizing that in astral experiences, would be the term that he used to describe these experiences, astral visions, there were various places that one could go to which seemed like well-established places, right? So kind of like if you go to Germany, it's like, oh, you need to go to Berlin, right? You might want to check out Black Forest. Crowley thought that when you travel to the other world, there's certain places which seem to be well-trodden. And so he talks about these different topographical regions. So one of these regions he calls the Egyptian plane. Another one he calls the alchemical plane. Another one he calls the Celtic plane. And clearly here he's referencing the fact that there's an indefinitely large number of these places, right? But that through human activity, through humans essentially traveling to these places, a certain sort of charge builds up, right? And these places take on definite shape. So Crowley is recognizing the existence of the imaginal. At least that's the way I read it here, right? He's saying that there seems to be these encounters which a number of people can get to if they're interested. Okay, back to Corban. So Corban wanted to give an account of what was going on in the imaginal world, and he thought that the mundus imaginalis, the world of the imagination, was accessed through what he called imaginative consciousness or cognitive imagination. This is a fancy way of saying that we have a particular faculty for accessing this particular plane of existence. So here's Corban. The imaginative function makes it possible for all the universes to symbolize with each other, and by way of experiment, it enables us to imagine that each substantial reality assumes forms that correspond to each respective universe. The cognitive function of imagination provides the foundation for a rigorous analogical knowledge, permitting us to evade the dilemma of current rationalism, which gives us only a choice between two banal dualistic terms of either matter or mind. That's dense, so I want to break it down a little bit. The first point to note is that Corban is saying that the imaginative function makes it possible to symbolize universes of wide diversity, right? So the imaginative function has this capacity to synthesize various planes or dimensions of being into the content of a symbol, right? And he further says that the cognitive function of imagination provides the foundation for a rigorous analogical knowledge, permitting us to evade the dilemma of current rationalism. So the idea there is that there is a particular way of knowing through imagination, right? That it has an epistemological function, that it has a way of getting us to aspects of reality that can, in a way, only be accessed through the imagination. Okay, so the mundus imaginalis is accessed through through imaginative consciousness or the cognitive imagination. Okay, so this is what I was just talking about from Corban's quote. The imaginative function symbolizes the correspondence between seemingly diverse, even contradictory substantial realities. And it produces images that synthesize these diverse orders of being. So one way to start wrapping our heads around what that means is, look, let's just sort of table whether or not there are all of these separate independent planes of existence. One thing I think that we can say for sure is that there are different modes through which we access the universe of our experience, right? So we talk about emotional people as sensing the world through their emotions, right? The medium through which reality makes its presentation, right, is through the lens of the emotions, right? Somebody who is of a logical type, right, accesses much of the reality through intellection, through cognition. Somebody who is intuitive, right, may access large portions of their world through intuition. So there's these different ways in which we gain access to what is real. And that is not even mentioning the types of experiences that we encounter in visionary experience, right? So what Corban, I think, is saying here is that, look, when you are presented with an image or a symbol on the astral, that symbol is loaded with information from a variety of different sources, right? And some of those sources can even be contradictory, but the symbol has a way of making that available to the individual. And he says that it provides the basis for an analogical mode of knowing. So what does this mean, an analogical mode of knowing? When we talk about analogical knowledge, usually what we're saying is this thing is like that thing, right? This thing shares this similarity with that thing, or this thing is dissimilar from that thing. They don't share a relationship. And then we make judgments based upon those connections of similarity or difference. So one way to begin thinking about this is through the activity of dream interpretation. So dreams themselves present us with symbols, right? Symbols which often contain a lot of information. And when we begin to interpret a dream, there's a process of trying to figure out what that dream corresponds to, what that symbol in the dream is referring to in regards to our own particular life. So we have a dream, some crazy symbols come up in the dream, and we attempt to link it through a process of analogical knowing or similarity to other things that are occurring in our lives to give meaning or to decipher the message which was received in the dream. So here's an example of this, and this was just an example I made up off the cuff, and there's probably better ones. But so imagine you have a dream, and in this dream, you see yourself from the third person, right? So you're looking at yourself from outside yourself. But what you see is yourself sitting in the middle of a house, right? And the foundations of this house are crumbling. You can tell this is getting pleasant, right? The roof is starting to cave in. All the wallpaper is torn off, and there's big, parts of the walls missing. And you wake up from the dream, you're a bit distraught, and you ask yourself, what was that? How do I make sense of that? What was going on? So how would you begin making sense of that? Well, the first thing you might do is ask yourself, what are these symbols corresponding to? Is there something in my life that the symbols that arise in the dream are attempting to make me conscious of? And so here's a breakdown, an interpretation. And obviously there can be a number of interpretations about dreams, and it's a practical art figuring out what interpretation fits best for your own particular life. But here's one way in which we might go about interpreting this. So the house, right? What might we think that the house is like, right? What is it trying to symbolize? Well, the house is often taken as a symbol of the conscious world that the individual has built up for themselves, right? So building your house is a metaphor, or tending your house, right? Tending to your house is a metaphor that people often use for tending to the various aspects of their life, right? So in a way, it represents the world of the conscious ego. And in this dream, the foundations are crumbling, right? The house has been neglected. So maybe there's something else here that the dream is symbolizing. Maybe there's something in your own conscious world which is being neglected, right? And let's say, for instance, you have a bunch of bills that you've been neglecting to look at for a long time, right? They've been sitting on a shelf, and you've been meaning to get to them and to pay those bills, but you can't even bring yourself to look at them. But it's possible that if you neglect them for long enough, you'll find yourself in financial ruin, right? It could really cause your world to collapse, right? So the dream is trying to say something, right? And it's trying to say something on the basis of this analogical mode of knowing. Look, this thing is like that thing. And it takes your ability to decipher it in order to be able to translate that message into practical knowledge in your own life. So what is the dream doing? What is the symbol in the dream doing? Well, it's synthesizing a seemingly diverse, even contradictory array of elements of existence. So in this particular case, the dream symbolizes a number of things. It symbolizes the conscious world of the individual. It symbolizes their conscious psychological state of neglect. It symbolizes a possible future outcome of falling into financial ruin. And it's taking all of these things and putting them together in image and presenting them to the individual so that they can move forward in their life. Okay, so the dream, in a sense, or the symbol, affords one this analogical knowledge. So these are propositions generated on the basis of such symbolic correspondences. So if I neglect my house, then I might fall into financial ruin. This is a proposition which can be generated through the function of the imagination, right? And it can access something real in the world, something of substantial importance. So what Corban wants to say is that when we travel in the spirit world, the information we bring back from those encounters can give us insight into the nature of our own lives and into reality, right? So insofar as the imaginative function confers knowledge, it can be treated as having a robust ontological status, right? It accesses something real. That's ontological status. Is just a way of saying, so the status of something being real. And so a conclusion we might draw from this is that the mundus imaginalis, the world of the imagination, is ontologically robust. It has a substantial reality, right? And by encountering that reality, we can bring back useful information to employ in our own lives and in the lives of our communities. All right, any questions so far? Confused? Distraught?
So it sounds like what you're saying is that this imaginative function helps us to see our blind spots.
I think that's one thing that it can do.
Right.
Right? So that is primarily no, I'm not going to say that. It's one of the ways in which Jungian analysts, right, will employ active imagination, is to help one integrate contents of the unconscious that they may not yet be conscious of, right? Because there might be particular motivations, psychological motivations or states that we've repressed or that we just don't want to look at. And through the process of active imagination, we establish a format so that we can integrate that material and become, move towards wholeness, right? Move towards a union of the unconscious and the conscious mind. But I don't think it's just restricted to that, right? So in the case of occultism, magic, mysticism, and visionary experience, you might get a communication which has nothing to do with your unconscious, right? It might tell you about something else entirely, right? It might not just be one of your blind spots.
Oh, like when Jung had visions of like the floods, and he was
Sure.
kind of foreseeing the First World War.
Right.
It was certainly not a personal unconscious issue of his.
Right, so Jung would say he was tapping into the collective unconscious at that point, right? And he was able to perceive and essentially prophesy the coming of a world war, right? Crowley did a pretty good job at that too. Both those books are read. Right? Right, so does that make sense? Like sometimes it can be about our personal blind spots, and that is really useful knowledge to have. Other times, it can be about other things. Okay? One of the things I like to think about is like remote viewing. There's some interesting experiences with remote viewers seeing a place, right? Remote viewing a particular location, and they get it wrong. But the reason why they get it wrong was either because that place that they saw was the place as it was either like 20 years earlier or 20 years later, right? And so that would be a case of like, I don't know if that's healing somebody's blind spot. It's more like you're getting some information about the world, right? Given that we can, you know, see that those experiments are working with some accuracy.
I remember
Yeah.
reading an article in was it the SF Weekly, and they had an article on viewing, and people were trying to view who's going to be the next president. And they couldn't access it. They had no answers, but all they got was death and destruction and all this horrible stuff. And then months, or like a year or two later, 9/11. I remember that. And I was like, wait a minute, I still have that article because I was interested in it.
Yeah, so there are interesting results which are worthy of at least taking a look at, right? Considering. Okay, so here's another quick thing I threw together, everyone's favorite Venn diagram. So in one of these spheres we have the imaginative realm, right? And we might just consider for the moment that it's a distinct order of reality populated by a various order of beings and of symbols. And then on the other hand we have the world of our everyday empirical consciousness, right? The world of everyday experience. And oftentimes these two different realms don't interact much, right? You have to be pretty hard-nosed to make it in the material world and succeed there, and sometimes that involves the suppression of the imagination. But like I was saying, what we do when we scry is an attempt to make a deliberate break with our ordinary modes of cognition. And that's where the experience of the imaginal comes in. And these two distinct levels of reality begin to blend and melt together. Right? So in the visionary experience, one of the ways I like to think about it is that you're not just in the imaginative realm, right? You're not just dealing with stuff which is way out there. Oftentimes it's an experience of what's going on in the material realm from the perspective of the imaginal, right? And that's how we get that analogical knowledge, right? Is by going into the spirit realm and looking at the world through the eyes of spirit and seeing how spirit conceives the world. And then we bring that back into the material realm, right? And suddenly, when we're back with eyes of spirit, eyes of the spirit, we start to see that the material realm is in fact imbued with the imaginal, right? That the imaginal begins to seep through, that it's there all the time. And so ultimately, I think that this distinction begins to collapse through the practice of vision magic, right? One's mundane experience becomes more imaginal, and at the same time, one's visionary experiences become more material, right? They give us access to more of the material world. And so it's this middle section I think that we occupy when we get into visionary states. And I haven't thought all this totally through. I'm just trying to give a sort of a brief sketch. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about Jung, because I think Jung is a very important figure in this story. And what I'm going to say now, I don't want to conflate the archetypal world with the imaginal world. I don't want to say they're the same thing. Right? I'm not trying to say they're the same thing. But I am trying to say that there are important similarities between the two. Right? So I want to talk a little bit about Jung and the collective unconscious. So in scrying, in vision magic, we induce an altered state of consciousness whereby we gain access via the imaginative function to the topographical regions of the mundus imaginalis, the imaginal world. And Jung had a very similar notion, or at least there seemed to be significant similarities between what Corbin called the mundus imaginalis and what Jung called the collective unconscious. And what Jung was referring to when he was talking about the collective unconscious is the structure or architecture of the unconscious mind. The unconscious has particular architectural features that are common across the entire species. And so when we access the unconscious, we access essentially the mind of humanity, right? The world soul. And there are certain reoccurring symbols that Jung found occur when people begin to access the unconscious. So the Great Mother, right? The Primordial Mother, the Wise Old Man, the Shadow, the Trickster. There's a number of these archetypes that Jung sort of identified and thought were architectural features of the unconscious mind, and that we can encounter these through dreams, through mythology, through film and literature. And even if we don't know it, what we're gaining access to is a level of psyche which transcends our own particular individual empirical consciousness. And of course there's the personal unconscious as well, which is the structure of our own individual unconscious, right? And so that might be populated with images from our own individual history, right? Our family background, our societal backgrounds, maybe even idiosyncrasies of our own biology. But for Jung, the first step was to engage the personal unconscious through something like imagination and symbol, and that this would eventually lead one into the collective, right? So as one went deeper and started to peel back the layers of their own individual psyche, they would eventually begin to encounter these collective symbols, these symbols which are common across all cultures, peoples. And Jung thought that it was through the imagination and through what he called active imagination, or at least this is one route that Jung took, that one could wade through the content of the personal unconscious and reach the collective and gain deep insight into the nature of one's own psyche and the psyche of humanity, right? Something that a psychologist would be really interested in doing. And I think this is also the route through which we get in contact with the mundus imaginalis, right? So I think as we experience tonight, when we scry, oftentimes, the first stuff which starts to come up is like more reflective, the personal unconscious, right? And then as the story develops, you begin to go deeper down the rabbit hole, and the images often become more collective and charged. And there is the potential of breaking through kind of like peak experiences and psychedelic experiences to the other side, right? And to be honest, I think I've had a lot of success with scrying, but it is still rare, I think, to really plunge and have sort of extraordinary astral visions, right? It's a hard thing to do. It doesn't happen for me all the time. Every once in a while I get there. But I think this is kind of the route, as far as I can tell from my own experience. Your mileage may vary. Okay, here's Crowley again, and so I want to talk about what this encounter with the unconscious is like. Crowley had a really good grasp on this. He was on point when it came to the encounters and the phenomenology of the encounters with other levels of being. So phenomenology is a fancy way of saying what the experience is like. Right? So the phenomenology of the unconscious, we're basically talking about what it's like to have an experience of the unconscious. And here's Crowley, and this is notes from an astral atlas, and he's talking about astral visions. Right? So he says, the essence of the right sensation consists in recognition of the reality of the other being. There will be, as a rule, some element of hostility, even when the reaction is sympathetic. One's soulmate, even, is not thought of as oneself at first contact. One must therefore insist that any real appearance of the astral plane gives the sensation of meeting a stranger. One must accept it as independent. One must realize on writing up the record that the meeting has effected a definite change in oneself. One must have known and felt something alien and not merely tried on a new dress. There must always be some slight pang of pain in a true astral vision. It hurts the self to have to admit the existence of a not-self, and it taxes the brain to register a new thought. This is true at the first touch, even when exaltation and stimulation result from the joy of making agreeable contact. Right? So the point that Crowley is attempting to drive home here is that in an astral vision, it should feel like you are experiencing another, something other than yourself. Right? There is a definite sensation when the ego has to register the existence of the non-ego. And an encounter on the astral plane with another order of being, I think often does, even when it's agreeable, even when it's joyous, disrupt the conscious mind, right? It has to begin to process and figure out how to integrate all the new information into its conception of who it is, and what reality is. Okay, I'm going to compare this with Jung now. Okay, so Philemon. Philemon was the guide. It was Jung's wizard archetype, Jung's wise old man archetype, who led him through the processes of the descent into the underworld and distilling that content into meaningful things that Jung could do in his life. So Philemon and the other figures of my fantasies brought home to me the crucial insight that there are things in the psyche which I did not produce, but which produce themselves and have their own life. Philemon represented a force which was not myself. In my fantasies, I held conversations with him, and he said things which I had not consciously thought. For I observed clearly that it was he who spoke, not I. So Jung is saying the encounter with Philemon was, for all intents and purposes, the encounter with another being. And that Philemon was able to communicate to Jung things that he did not know, right? Conferred knowledge that Jung did not himself have. So just continuing with Jung here, I've got a couple of quotes, so bear with me. He confronted me in an objective manner, and I understood that there is something in me which can say things that I do not know and do not intend. Things which may even be directed against me. So this is crazy, right? So Jung is saying, look, I encountered things inside me, which weren't me, which didn't even like me. Some of them did, some of them didn't. And there was this whole other world that I was able to encounter through the process of active imagination. Whenever the outlines of a new personification appeared, I felt it almost as a personal defect. Okay? That's so interesting. It meant, here's something else you didn't know until now. Fear crept over me that the succession of figures might be endless, that I might lose myself in the bottomless pit of ignorance. My ego felt devalued. And so this is what Crowley's saying when he's saying he experiences this pain in trying to register the non-ego, right? It hurts, right? It hurts to have to process the new information. And it's scary, right? It's an encounter with the unknown. So, and again, that's one of the reasons why we employ ritual technology is to attempt to contain the activity, right? To direct it. I've seen people go spectacularly wrong with that, for what it's worth. Okay, sorry for this long one. Here it is. Okay. It is, of course, ironical that I, a psychiatrist, should at almost every step of my experiment here run into the same psychic material, which is the stuff of psychosis and is found in the insane. This is the fund of unconscious images which fatally confuse the mental patient. But it is also, I love this, the matrix of a mythopoetic imagination which has vanished from our rational age. Right, so one of Jung's project was to try and restore the reality of the imaginal, right? And the fund of psychic energy and images that it contained. Right? And he thought that that was the route that humanity needed to take. It needed to be reintroduced to its ancient heritage of essentially the pagan world, right? Of living in a world populated with other levels of being. Through such imagination, though such imagination is present everywhere, it is both tabooed and dreaded. No wonder. So that it even appears to be a risky experiment or a questionable adventure to entrust oneself to the uncertain path that leads into the depths of the unconscious. But hey, we're at the O.T.O, we're going to do this. It is considered that the path of error, of equivocation and misunderstanding, unpopular, ambiguous, and dangerous. It is a voyage of discovery to the other pole of the world. Right, so you can think about that Venn diagram again. On the one hand, the imaginal, on the other hand, the material world. And this is a kind of a voyage into the other side. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about what to do when we scry. Questions, comments? Somebody have the time?
It's 8:45.
8:45. Wow. Okay. Okay. So I need to run through this quickly. Betrachten. So this is a German word which means making something pregnant by giving it your attention. Those powerful eyes.
Kind of like a pregnant pause.
So an example I like to give is like you walk past the same tree every day, right? On your way to work or in your backyard, you walk past it every day. You really don't give it a second thought. And one day you stop and you actually look at the tree and you're like, wow, I've never actually really paid much attention to this tree. And you decide to sit down and draw it. And you draw it for a couple of hours, let's say. You sit there and draw the tree. You pay attention to all its gnarled curves and the texture of its bark. And when you're done, that tree is a different tree, right? It's become something different to you because you've given it this attention. You've paid attention to it. And I think something similar happens when we begin to attend to what's going on inside, right? When we turn our attention inwards and begin to attend to the fund of psychic images inside us. So this is what Jung called active fantasy. Right? You turn your attention inward toward your inner landscape with an attitude of expectation. I'm going to start talking about the procedure that we're going to be using when we're scrying. So you turn your attention inward toward your inner landscape with an attitude of expectation. You're expecting something to happen. And what you want to do is let an environment suggest itself to you, organically and intuitively. So everyone just close your eyes for a minute. Take a couple of deep breaths. Breathe in. Breathe out. In. And out. And I want you to imagine a forest. want you to see, where are you looking at this forest from? Are you inside the forest? Are you above it? Is it daytime or nighttime in this forest? Is there a sun in the sky, or stars, or a moon? Do you hear anything? The whistling of wind through your ears? Maybe the running of water? And if you can, I want you to reach out and touch the bark of one of the trees. Is the bark soft, smooth, or rough and jagged? All right, open your eyes. So I just prompted you to have an environment suggest itself. You all just scried a forest. Your own particular forest. That's a very brief exercise, but it should acquaint you with what it feels like to have an environment begin to suggest itself. That's what it feels like. And you might say to yourself, I'm just imagining this. And you are. Right? But you're going to follow that. You're going to pay attention to it and see what it has to offer. So the next step is to interact with that environment to see what it's like. Use all 5 senses to explore the environment. So we touched on sight, we touched on touch, we touched on hearing. You could have tasted the bark, right? Smell, right? You use all your senses to try and engage the environment. Once you have an environment formed, right, when you get there, the next thing to do is to, if an entity or a guide hasn't already showed up, ask for one. Say something like, is there anybody here I can talk to? Someone shows up, ask it its name. What's your name? What do people call you? Ask it if it has any symbols. Often when I ask that, I'll just get a flash of symbols, right? Or something will just form slowly. Sometimes I often get desert landscapes, and I've had, beings draw something in the sand, the desert. Ask it if it has anything to teach you. Have something to tell you. This is ultimately the purpose of why we are doing this, is to make contact with a being from a distinct level of reality. So ask it if it has information for you. And if it gives you some information, ask about that information, right? Ask it more questions. Begin to engage it in dialogue. I often find that these visions are very organic and intuitive. They just kind of unfold. And oftentimes at the very beginning you're thinking, I'm just imagining all this. Man, what am I doing? I'm so stupid. And then suddenly at the end of it, you've got this spectacular vision, right? And it just kind of develops. It just kind of unfolds. And I think too, you can recognize when it's done. Oftentimes the being or the entity will just say, I'm done, right? I've got nothing else to say. You've gotten what you needed from me. Go on your way. And there's a sensation that I think is recognizable once the communication has wrapped up. And you can kind of just be like, yeah, that was it. Time to come back. Right? Okay, so question the entity or guide. Now, when the session is over, this is very important. I can't stress this highly enough. Write down your experience. Write it down. Immediately. Right? Write it down as thoroughly and accurately as you can. If you don't, you'll forget it, or you'll forget significant portions of it. It's kind of like waking up from a dream, and like 12 hours later, you're like, wait, what? It was really distinct when I woke up. I remember nothing about it now. But if you write it down, like that dream is with you for a long time, and you can always go back to your record and look at it again. Another thing that I do when I'm doing this on my own is I just open up the voice memo app on my phone, and I speak out loud the experiences that I'm having, so that I have an audio recording of it, and I can get it down accurately. Okay, embodiment. So what do you do once you have this vision in your hands? And you're like, okay, so what do I do with this? Unfortunately, I have to run through this really fast. I would spend more time on this. So essentially what we're doing is giving form to the formless. We've got to find some way to implement this stuff in our lives. So the first thing to do is journal, and then the next thing to do is to interpret the vision. And you can interpret it in much the same way that you might interpret a dream. If you don't have much experience with dream interpretation, here's just a very quick heuristic of a technique that you can use called amplification. It's a Jungian term. And this is the process of amplifying symbols by linking them to images in other domains. Right? So if you have a symbol appear to you, you might ask yourself, via a process of analogical knowing, what is this symbol like? What does this remind me of? What associations does this symbol bring to mind? Oftentimes you'll get other associations from literature, from film, from mythology, from world religions, from archaeology, from basically the fields of human endeavor which deal in symbols, right? And it also might remind you of things in your own life, past experiences. Right? But by taking a symbol and then amplifying it, you basically just do a process of free association. Take the symbol and write down all the things that come to mind when you're thinking about that symbol. And then when you go back to that symbol, it will have more meaning, right? You'll have amplified it by the process of linking it up to all of these other symbols. And you do that for the distinct symbols which occur in your vision, and then intuitively, interpretation of the vision begins to form. Right? This is an art, right? It takes practice. You just start doing it. You just start doing it, and as you do it over and over again, you begin to get good at it. Right? Ethical obligations. So one thing that I always recommend people asking is, what practical information can you give me when you're talking to the entity that you encounter, if you do encounter an entity? What practical information can you give me that I can bring to my life? And when you get an ethical obligation, what I mean by that is just some practical information that you can live out, right? So when you get information from the spirit world and you get a communication that you need to look at your bills, right? And you then look at your bills, you're communicating back. You're saying, look, I'm paying attention. I recognize you. I understand that you said something to me that I need to take account of. And it's almost a talismanic act, right? You are embodying that spiritual force by doing that thing. Right? So you can think about, well, what should I do, right? What kind of community, what can I do given the vision that I have? Also dream work, right? So I find that symbols which occur in the scrying will often appear in dreams, right? And so it's something to pay attention to, right? To see if these things are occurring in other places. And there's also a way of, when you dream, let's say you have a dream, you want to know more about it, you can go scry, right? And you can go in with the intention of exploring that house that you experienced in the dream and go find out more about it. And art, of course, right? Paint a painting, right? Which is of the being you encountered. It's a talismanic act. Write poetry, compose a song. It's a way of taking the formless and embodying it in the world, and that is a magical act. And I guarantee that if you do that, there will be energetic resonance which is produced from that. Right? Things will start to move. I'm going to skip over that because we don't have time. Okay. So, steps to keep in mind as we're scrying. So the first thing is we're going to relax and get into this receptive state through a relaxation meditation. Then formulate an environment. And let it, so this is a little misleading, just let it formulate itself, right? Allow it to occur organically and intuitively. It's going to be something like what you experienced as we are scrying a forest. There's going to be some prompting from yourself. You're going to see yourself in it, right? You're going to recognize that part of that is you, right? But it will begin to develop and take on a shape of its own if you follow it. Right? Interact with it to see what it's like. Use your senses, right? That will provide it a mechanism for beginning to form and take on shape. If a guide or an entity hasn't already appeared, just call for one. Say, is there somebody I can talk to? Okay. Ask it its name. Ask it if it has any symbols. Say, do what thou wilt shall be the whole law. See what it says back. And then ask it if it has something to teach you, right? Something you can do. And then let the vision develop organically, intuitively. I touched that earlier. And then once you're done, write up as much as you can, remember from your vision in your record. And that's a really important part. I can't stress that enough. Write it down. And most importantly, trust yourself. I think people often have the tendency to think, I'm just making this up. I'm no good at this. I can't do this. This is advanced magic. No, it's not. You can do this. Trust yourself. Okay. Questions, comments. I'm sorry, we're already running late into the evening.
Paper and some draw.
Yeah. We'll get that in just a minute.
Yeah.
Other questions, comments? Okay, so we're going to do this thing.